I'd like to welcome to the podcast my special guest for this episode, Dr. James Dawkins. Welcome to the podcast, James.
Hi there. Good morning, Rachel. It's fantastic to be here. Thank you for your time, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion.
Yeah, me too. We've had a few conversations before, and our conversations can just keep going. So we'll try and keep this one within the time of the podcast. We'll do our very best. But
Sure.
I really enjoy chatting to you and finding out lots of different things. So I think that would be great to just give the listeners an idea of what your field of specialism is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I am a doctor in 18th and early 19th century Jamaican and British history, with a specific focus on the slave owning history of the Dawkins family. Of course, that's the same surname as mine. My surname is Dawkins, and the slave owners who owned my ancestors was also Dawkins. And in fact, they are the foreparents and ancestors of Professor Richard Dawkins, this prominent atheist and zoologist. So my work looks at how the slave owning Dawkins family used the ownership of my enslaved ancestors to transform themselves into an elite gentrified county family. More broadly, my research, my PhD, it studies and traces the permeation, so that's to say the absorption of African produced wealth into the social, economic, cultural and physical fabric of Britain, so that, I mean, and this really helps us to understand how some of our nation's most beloved and also iconic organizations and structures were enriched by the finance generated from the transatlantic slave economy. So, and that's to say, so thinking about country houses, museums, schools, universities, industrial factories, banks, and railways. How did they all benefit from? How were they all enriched by the transatlantic slave economy?
And I think the more you look into this, and particularly when you've got a personal interest in ancestry, that the more you research, the more you want to go further, and the more you find it's just everywhere, isn't it? And that's quite. I was quite amazed at how widely spread that wealth is across the UK, and how we're still benefiting from it in such a wide way.
Absolutely. I think when I first started my study on the Dawkins family, I just thought, well, maybe they owned, several hundred enslaved African people in Jamaica, and that to be honest, I wasn't sure what they did with the money. And it was from, I think there's 6 chapters to my doctoral research, and there's one on politics. So you see how Westminster and also local county offices such as sheriff and councillors and mayors, how wealth is used to canvass for those positions. What another chapters on education and culture. So you see how the Dawkins family and other slave owning families spend their money on educating their children at some of our most prestigious public schools, such as Harrow, Westminster, Rugby, Eton, and also how they then graduate from those schools, the sons of the slave owners, and they go to be educated at some of our most elite universities, such as Oxford, Cambridge, Gray's Inn, and so there's a range of, I guess, societal fabrics, areas that make up British society. Country houses, the Dawkins family, they've owned several large country estates and country houses. And so as I began to learn about this, I started, it's really strange. I go out to the countryside because I'm a member of the at least my mum's a member of the National Trust, and we visit, properties, fairly frequently, once or twice a year, and it was amazing how the properties themselves and also the material culture in them. So that's to say, could be some of the paintings, some of the objects inside them, how they've been purchased with and by money with money that was generated from the transatlantic slave economy, either with the individuals that own the houses and the objects being uh, the owners of enslaved Africans, or they could
Mm.
be traders, or they could be the processors or manufacturers of raw materials that were imported from the colonies. People have become very wealthy and rich off of that, or they could be bankers as well. And slavery it's everywhere. I think I could speak to this. I would just say um, when I first came to Nottingham, I didn't know much about Nottingham and slavery. And subsequent research, which I think we'll probably come on to later on in the podcast, on Nottingham and Nottingham's universities and the city's connections to the transatlantic slave economy, through doing the kind of like 2 years of methodical, meticulous research,
Mm.
started to see how deeply embedded the finances and profits of slavery are. And every time that I walk somewhere, I was on a road the other day in Mansfield, and it was called Welbeck Road or Portland Road. And those are very important and significant names when it comes to slavery in the Portland family. I think, as some people know, they're I think back in the 1700s, I think it was the first Duke of Portland was the colonial governor of Jamaica from 1722 to 1726, and he owned enslaved people. And so you start to make all these connections. It's
Yeah,
it's really fascinating.
it really is. Yeah. And I wasn't aware of that. And I actually had an art studio on the Welbeck estate for about a year.
Oh wow.
And it was just it was just going from a very industrial town like Ilkeston, where my studio was for years, and then I went to Welbeck. It was just so different, and it was a beautiful place.
Hmm.
And I really enjoyed my time at Welbeck, but it just didn't. It just wasn't me. It wasn't quite right. So I looked at coming back to Nottingham, um, and into the studio where I currently am. But I think it's that when you start to delve, and I think that going around cities and you see those names, you might see them in plaques and statues, and that was part of one of your studies, wasn't it, to actually look at those connections in Nottingham and look at those
Mm.
names that are featured on statues and plaques and street names, and look at their connections. So could you tell us a little bit about that review?
Yeah, absolutely. So shortly after the murder of George Floyd, there've been a lot of protests with the Black Lives Matter, and also, obviously, as you know, this public contestation around statues and slavery, the oppression of Black people by white people and white supremacy in particular. And as you know, I think many people will who watch this podcast, the statue of Edward Colston, a prominent trader in enslaved African people, Bristolian trader in enslaved African people, was torn down
Mm,
and toppled and discarded into the Bristol Harbour. And of course, there are a lot of other statues that were graffitied on or protested over, and it raised really important questions, national and public questions about commemoration of individuals with questionable histories. In this case, individuals who are connected to slavery, empire, and the exploitation of African people and appropriation of their labor.
yeah.
And I believe in that shortly after George Floyd was murdered, there were 130 Labour councils across the country that had said they would be commissioning at some point a review in the near future a review into the statues, plaques, and street names that are dotted around their cityscapes in an effort to understand which of those are connected to or represent individuals connected and linked to the transatlantic slave economy, and then to have a public discussion on debate about their appropriateness.
Yeah.
And so Nottingham City Council was one of those. It was in one of the 130 councils that said it would commission this study. They approached the University of Nottingham, which I was working as a research fellow at the time, and they asked me and one other colleague to if we'd be willing to undertake a review of statues, plaques, and street names. And of course, this is our area of speciality, and I'd signed up to that. This is our area of kind of like specialism and expertise. So I kind of jumped on board, and I identified 83 monuments that represent individuals in some way,
Mm.
and I think around about half of those are connected to individuals, or represent individuals that are in some way connected to the transatlantic slave economy. And the results are all in the report, but essentially, there's some really problematic iconography, and I kind of flagged this up. For example, I'm thinking about on South Parade Street in Nottingham City Centre, there's a plaque which commemorates the establishment of Smith's Bank in,
Yes.
I believe it's 1652. And Smith's Bank play later on in the 1700s, they play a really big role in financing the transatlantic slave economy, and also the bank's directors, in particular Lord Carrington, after which Carrington Street is named. He and several other partners in the bank, family members, owned, this was around 1792, 237 enslaved African people across 3 properties in Jamaica. And of course, this isn't something that's publicly mentioned. It's not particularly
Mm.
well known, but the plaque is there on the wall commemorating this family and the bank. And it's got a mantra on it that says something about, with honor, fidelity, and dignity, the hard work of these individuals has led to the establishment of Smith's Bank. And so I think it's kind of digging into and drilling down into some of the individuals and the organizations that these plaques and iconography and represents. Really, in this report, which hasn't been published yet, you start to see that there's some really questionable iconography dotted around Nottingham. I think in the Arboretum as well, there's a picture of Samuel Morley. It's a
Yeah.
very complicated picture because some of these individuals, and organizations, they're philanthropists as well. And so there's these complicated moral geographies that organizations and individuals who are connected to the transatlantic slave economy have, because on the one hand, they can be philanthropists and abolitionists, but at the same time, as I'll speak to later on, they also profit from the transatlantic slave economy. And it's a bit of a, how do we understand these individuals and how does that all work? And so, yes, I conducted a study, composed the findings in a 70 page report. It's currently with Nottingham City Council. It hasn't been published yet, but hopefully I'll be putting a bit of, giving them a bit of a nudge. That will be
Yeah.
published, and it can be used by people to learn a little bit more about Nottingham's cityscape and kind of, these commemorative objects that are linked to slavery, but you wouldn't know. It's kind of like
Yeah.
slavery hidden in plain sight.
Very much so. Yeah. And you kindly shared with me a copy so that I could research for this very podcast. And I've lived on the Derby Notts border for my entire life, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm very familiar with a lot of these statues and plaques and the names. I grew up in a town called Hena, which was built on textiles and coal. Morley's,
Mm,
still there was still a Morley's factory in Hena when I grew up. And in fact, my very first public artwork was to create a gateway sculpture for the town of Hena on the very corner of the plot where the old I.R. Morley's factory once stood. And it's stuff like this that it's not out there, is it? And so this report was just so fascinating to read, and these places are so familiar, but they do need highlighting, and we do need to take more notice of what's around us. And I think very much so, as being a sculptor and starting to create more figurative pieces that's
mm,
representing our rich history and culture, having those stories there and accessible is a really important part of my work. Is how do we make those stories accessible once the sculpture has been placed somewhere? How does that story continue, and how do people access it? So it's a very interesting report. It highlights those very strong connections to
mm,
individuals who profited greatly from slavery. But what's interesting as well is that it also highlights individuals that were against slavery and
mhm,
worked very hard to try and abolish slavery and to try and improve the lives of many. And there's
mm.
would you like to pick out one from that, or are you
Yeah,
happy for me to sort of signpost one?
yeah, no, I will. So I'll just set the scenario. So there's an individual that most people will know called Samuel Morley. He became the director of the I&R Morley textile firm that was established back in the early 1700s. Sorry, in the late 1700s, and I believe Samuel Morley became the director around about 1865, I think around there, or 1872. And this is a factory which is drawing on the cotton supplies of like spun cotton, which it's that's being this is in the early 1800s, and that spun cotton is being acquired from the partially from the Struts, and the
Yeah,
Strutt cotton spinning companies. They have several factories based in Derbyshire. They've got their Cromford mill, etc., and they purchase raw cotton from suppliers in the west of England, Liverpool, etc., who are sourcing it from the Americas and the Caribbean, where it's grown by enslaved African people. And so you have this connection between is you have this connection between Samuel Morley and IMR Morley's as a firm, and its use of spun cotton. It manufacture it into garments, which are then sold to members of the general public, and of course. The firm are profiting greatly from this. In
mm.
fact, I&R Morley's becomes one of the largest textile manufacturing houses in Great Britain in the mid to late 1800s. And so there's this, benefiting as I say, an enrichment from key cash crop cotton, which
Yeah,
is grown by enslaved African people. But on the other hand, you have Samuel Morley, who becomes the director of the firm, as I say, around the 1860s or 70s, and as much he's very he's known to be an abolitionist, a social reformer, a philanthropist, and in fact he establishes despite the origins and connection sorry, the origins of the cotton, he establishes a friendship with a man called Josiah Henson. Henson is an African American who escapes from slavery. He strikes up a friendship with Samuel Morley, and Samuel invites him to stay at his house in Nottingham and London. And Samuel actually funds Josiah Henson's. It's an autobiography called Dawn Settlement, which details Henson's experience of enslavement and his escape from slavery in the Americas via the Underground Railroad.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's as I say, it's this complicated moral geography of a company that's drawing on drawing on raw materials produced by enslaved people, but then the owner of the company, you know, being an ardent abolitionist. It's like, how do you
Mm,
make sense of the two? It's
yeah.
really complicated. It's fascinating, and of course, one of the talking spots, if people are interested in learning a little bit more about Morley, or indeed viewing some of the commemorative iconography to him, there is there's a bust in the Nottingham Arboretum which commemorates Samuel Morley. It's an interesting piece, and I think that it's something, it's publicly accessible. People can go there and see it, and it'll start to I guess it'll provoke thought and discussion. It's a good talking
Yeah.
point for who we celebrate, why we celebrate them, what is celebrated, what is left in and what is left out. Because often of the narrative that surrounds these individuals, because with Samuel Morley, he's known for being an abolitionist and social reformer and
Mm,
philanthropist and political radical. But what isn't known, as I say, is his firm's connection to and also to the transatlantic slave economy in particular, the plantation economy in the Americas. And it's not to say that you know I want to tear down, tarnish, or muddy his reputation, but it's adding to the picture, adding to the context, adding to the complexity,
yes.
of these individuals and their characters in a bid to understand how complicated slavery is.
The points you raise about people like Samuel Morley and the
Mhm.
statues, it is so complex, and it's, you can't sort of look at this at a sculpture or a memorial statue and say it's one thing or the other. It's a whole narrative, and I think it's how we then talk about that narrative. I think that's important, isn't it? And how we discuss, that complexity, because it is a complex story and it's not cut and dry. And I think that's what your report shows, is that there are so many different levels of connection, of complexity, that yes, his family had such a lot of wealth, and it's interesting you point out about the wealth coming from that spun cotton, which, getting that raw material so cheap because it was picked by enslaved labor forces, so that meant that raw material was cheap. And a lot of people that I talk to, and I'm talking about this project and say that it's going to Nottingham, and they say, well, Nottingham, how is Nottingham connected to the slave trade? And that's they made lace. And I said, well, where do you think that material came from? Where's that raw material coming from? They have to buy that spun cotton from somewhere, and where does the material for the spun cotton come from? It's picked in terrible conditions by the enslaved. They're buying it as a cheap material. It's coming into places like Derbyshire, that's spun then into thread, that's then going to cities like Nottingham, that's then underpinning the wealth of the textile industry. And it's interesting how people don't necessarily see that connection, because it is very, very complex, isn't it, to see?
It is, and it's obscured. It's not as though someone like Samuel Morley or Nottingham as a city owns and has plantations in the Caribbean. Their connection, they don't, the nature of their connection is not that they are traders and enslaved African people or the owners of them. The connection is that they are sourcing, this material that's been produced by enslaved African people. And it's that because they're not owners or traders, they kind of just get lost in this vacuum or this abyss of, oh well, you can't, the connection is not as obvious, because
Mm,
you have to trace where you have to trace where the cotton is coming from. And so, I wouldn't say it's particularly difficult, but just because it's not there, it's not right immediately in front of your face. And so there are lots of questions about, so how can, how does this link, exist? How is that? So I think the other thing that I should have made uh, explicit from the beginning of this podcast, but I will do it now, better later than never, is that there's an important difference between the slave trade and slavery. And often people talk about, you know, um, uh, people benefiting from the slave trade. The um, the slave trade, or as I call it, trading enslaved African people, that's concerned with the capture, the imprisonment, and the exchange for British goods and other European manufactured goods, and the exchange of those for African people on the West Coast. That's what the trade is about. Slavery is about the forced toil and the ownership of African people, and the fruits of their labor. So slavery is concerned with the plantations in the Caribbean and the Americas, the ownership of these people. And so yeah, I just think it's important because it's not that Morley benefited from the slave trade. It's that he benefited from slavery and the enslavement of African people. So I just wanted to kind of like flag that up because often, yeah, as I say, there's a bit of confusion over that, and the mainstream media doesn't, the news outlets, they don't always make a distinction between the two.
Yeah, and it's how you've explained that. It makes it a lot. It's quite clear that
I
they're two
mean,
very different things. One of the other things that was clear in your report as well
mm,
was about people that were activists within the
mm,
city, both in the past and today, and it goes right up to so there's one that I noticed was about William Howitt, and his statue is featured in the Writers' Garden in Newstead, and he was an anti-slavery activist. But then you also feature Veronica Barnes, who featured on this podcast in an earlier episode, and
oh yeah,
her statue. So and there's also the plaques as well, and I think that's an important part of when you're walking around the city. And we touched on this when we spoke with the Nottinghamshire Women's History Network, and we talked about the Lace Market area, and we touched on one of the people in your report, which was George Africanus and his wife Esther, who ran
mm,
an employment agency. And you talk about George Africanus within this report as well. So it gives you a real in-depth look at some of these different features of Nottingham and Nottinghamshire. So as you're walking around and you see these, it gives you a clear picture, but also there's suggestions as well of things that we should be doing in the future. I mean, I just wondered if you wanted to touch on that, James, what you would like to see happen,
yeah.
with this report.
It'd be fantastic if we could develop this kind of self-guided, but also guided walks and tours of the city to, pass by some of these monuments,
Mm,
this iconography, commemorative iconography and plaques and statues. They're fantastic talking points. They provoke some really rich and interesting conversation. And I think that, historical walking tour of Nottingham City and its connections to the transatlantic slave economy would be amazing. I
mhm,
think one of the things which I have done is I worked with two other colleagues at the University of Nottingham, and we were able to acquire some funding to turn this research, because there's another piece of the report, which is the research on the street names which was conducted by my colleague, one of my colleagues at the University of Nottingham. And, to have the two together, so the plaques, the statues, and the street names, um, uh, we developed from those reports that are connected to slavery. We developed from those reports a suite of educational resources and this is in collaboration with several primary and local schools across Nottingham who are interested in integrating and developing more of a de I guess a colonial history into an understanding of colonial history and empire into their curriculum. And I will, at the end of this, when it comes to the kind of like listing some of the resources, I'll let people know where they can go to acquire these educational resources. They're free to download, and there's 6 specific individuals in the Statues and Plaques report who my colleagues and I have picked out to talk about their connections to slavery, but also, as you quite rightly said, the ways in which these individuals campaigned against slavery, historically, but all the way up, to the present, including people like Eric Irons. And so this is really, really important stuff. And I would like to see more counties and cities undertaking this kind of work because it's all about understanding, how Britain came to, Britain's modern formation, and the contribution that various groups of people, black, white, brown, have made towards the I guess, to this, to Britain's kind of like the social fabric. And so I will highlight some of those resources towards the end because I think people will find them really fascinating. I think the other thing I just wanted to say really quickly, and I guess this is a question for you, one of the findings from my report was that a very high proportion of the statues and plaques and street names, they commemorate individuals with not only links to slavery, but often these are men, they're males. There's a very, very low visibility of women who are commemorated just generally, regardless of whether they're connected to slavery or not, in the city. And that's a real issue. And it's something that I touch upon in the conclusion towards the discussion and conclusion section, in the report, this invisibility of women when they've played huge, really important and significant instrumental roles in the development of Nottingham. And I know that the statue that you're kind of working on at the moment speaks to this and tries to, and then is rendering them visible. And I was wondering, what your thoughts are on the invisibility and also the erasure of women's contribution to various quarters of Nottingham City and Nottingham County.
Yeah, it's something that, I'm quite passionate about, giving women from the past and right up until today a voice, because, when I've been researching my own female ancestors that lived in Nottingham and Nottinghamshire over the last few hundred years, it's so hard to find anything about them, but they contributed, they were here, they have made Nottingham what it is today. And to give them voice within the work that I'm doing, it feels like I have an important responsibility. And I think one of the Legacy Makers groups said to me the other day, the ancestors are on your shoulder, they're looking at what you're doing, and the ancestors are with us. And I quite like that feeling, that feeling like I'm trying to give them voice, the women that did not have a voice in society and now getting one, because it's so important. And I think the next few projects that I've got lined up are continuing on this narrative of giving women voice and looking at the past, with almost a mirror holding it up to things that are happening today. Because as I've been along this journey on this project, and to quite a degree with my previous project, Pilgrim Woman,
Hmm.
there's so many things that are happening today that were discussed at those times, like with the Pilgrim Woman series, looking really at tolerance and intolerance, religious persecution and migration and immigration. All of these are topics that are very much of today, and the same with this project as well. We're looking at the women's contribution specifically within the textile industry and that connection through that material of cotton. And there's
Mm,
some of the things that are coming up within the history research that are still prevalent today, like death through cotton lung, poor working conditions, the cost of fast fashion, the wealth
mm,
of a few at the cost to many. And some of these
mm,
things you would think would have changed, we would have learned, and it's, I think if I can highlight that in the sculpture, but it comes back to that point where we talked about earlier. It's about how that story can continue once you put something into your city, whether it be a plaque or a bust or a commemorative sculpture. It's about that narrative. And I think what you was talking about with the educational packs, I think that's a fantastic way forward, because if the children have that opportunity to learn the full breadth and not just a selected part of our history, but the full part of our history, that
mm,
I think that's a really important step forward. And there's a moment that there was myself and some of the project participants. We were stood in Nottingham talking to people about this project, about the statue, and we came across
mhm,
this family group, and they had two little girls, and I gave them a postcard, and we started talking to them, and the little girls chirped up, "We know all about this. It's about this," and they knew everything about it, and I was like, I could not believe it, and that they already knew, and they'd sort of taken it to heart, and like, yeah, we was talking about it in school. And it's just amazing that that the children, they are eager to sort of get that wider view, and they take it all on board, and then they in turn teach us. So that's
No,
kind of a long-winded way of going about like answering your question, but yeah, I think
no, I, I was just going to say, I completely agree with you. I think that it's so important because, given the history, uh, this or lack this erasure of women's and also black people's and brown people's contribution to the development of Nottingham, this and indeed Britain as a country, you know, that is not, healthy. It's to include their contributions, to talk about them and discuss them, and also why they have been, excluded. I think that these promote an understanding of systems of uh, omission, uh, as I said, systems of an understanding of systems of discrimination, um, and then it leads to talks about how we can be more accommodating, how we can be a more diverse and inclusive
yeah,
society. So it's kind of that classic case of the first step to resolving problem, sexism, racism, Islamophobia, whatnot, is to understand and acknowledge that there is an issue.
yeah,
And you and I are doing really important work, and many others in Nottingham, Bright Ideas, the University of Nottingham, Panya Banjoko,
mm,
many people and organisations, the National Justice Museum, to highlight these histories of omission, and then to promote discussion about them and why it's important that they are included. And I think that then in turn leads to um, initiatives such as yours, fantastic with regards to the statue, that will promote more discussion and understanding on this. And we're moving towards, I really do think that Nottingham City is ahead of many other cities, on the curve in this, in terms of promoting a more equality, diversity, inclusion, and a more understanding and accepting, generation
Yeah.
of people who will, you know, uh, try to understand and challenge these systems of discrimination and subjugation. So um, yeah, it's amazing stuff, and it's just so important. I'd encourage anyone. There are a lot of projects in and around Nottingham. People can contribute in various different ways, voluntarily, financially, intellectually, just going to discussions. Even in tuning into this podcast to find out what's going on.
Yeah.
And taking steps from there. But it's amazing stuff, and I think that what you and I both doing, along with the other kind of like wider cohort of individuals that are interested in equality, diversity, inclusion, is very much needed, and it's in the spirit. It's in the spirit of the time. So many people are eager, particularly our youngsters, our young generation, to get on with one another.
Yeah.
Um, and to stand for what's right, which is the inclusion of all people, regardless of their demographic.
Yeah. Beautifully put, James. Yeah, I think that's something that we can strive to do and make those changes. And let's hope that this opens the door for for new commemorations and new plaques and new street names that show that breadth of Nottingham, and highlights our sort of rich, diverse cultural history of today and the past. So yeah, let's hope that we can sort of make that difference. So I think before then we finish off. So let's have a look at resources. So if we've inspired somebody who's listening to this podcast to find out more, to go walk the streets of not just Nottingham, of any city, and find out more about those names on those street names or those plaques and statues, or find out more in general about slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, can you signpost us to any resources that we might be able to access?
Absolutely. The number one resource, in my opinion, to go to learn about the history of Britain's connections and links to the transatlantic slave economy is the Legacies of British Slavery website. If you type in Legacies of British Slavery, UCL, which is the acronym for University College London, you'll come across their website, and it looks at the political, cultural, physical, commercial legacies of slave ownership in Britain, and where all this money, where a lot of the money, particularly the compensation money that was paid to slave owners, was invested after it was dispensed in around 1836. That's a fantastic resource. I think another one is one that was created by myself. It's called Digital Resources for Nottingham's Legacy of Slavery. If you type that in to Google, so that's Digital Resources for Nottingham's Legacy of Slavery, you'll come across a link which is it's on the Nottingham City Council website, and it's got a series of teaching resources, primarily for teachers in schools, but anyone can kind of access this. And it talks about specific characters in and across Nottingham who have been commemorated in various ways, and their connections to the transatlantic slave economy, exploitative, abolitionist wise, social justice and human rights. And there's also a really helpful glossary there for understanding the terminology that is used or should be, we promote for using when explaining or trying to learn about slavery and race.
Yeah.
Fantastic suite of resources there. I would say that there is a documentary, two-part documentary on BBC iPlayer. It is called Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners. If you type that into Google, or you go on the BBC iPlayer website, you can watch that. Fantastic kind of overview of the ways in which Britain's modern formation is premised and predicated on the profits of, on the compensation money that was awarded to Britain's slave owners post 1833. The two other things, resources, which people may be interested in, are the Institute for the Study of Slavery. That's the acronym is ISOS. So that's the Institute for the Study of Slavery, and that's on the University of Nottingham's. It's kind of hosted on their webpage, and that contains a lot of information on research and community engagement projects, which are researching specifically Nottinghamshire's links to the transatlantic slave economy via its cotton. So that's a fantastic resource produced by Dr. Suzanne Seymour and Sherilyn Haggerty. And then the last thing I would say, in terms of, if people want to find out a little bit more about me and my research, you can type in James Dawkins, BBC Witness History. There's an interview on BBC Witness History. It'll come straight up on Google for you, where I sit down with Louise Heldago, a journalist from the BBC, to talk about my doctoral research on the Dawkins family and their connections to to the plantation economy and slave ownership, and what they did with the money, and how my feelings and my thoughts and feelings on doing all this research was. So a couple of resources for people there.
Wonderful. Wow. I think some of those I was aware of, and I've got links on the history page of the Standing in This Place project pages. But then there's some new ones there that I'm definitely going to be checking out, James. So I just want to thank you again for being such an amazing guest on the podcast. And as always, enjoy our conversations. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me on, Rachel. It's been a really great opportunity to discuss both of our work. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Standing in This Place podcast. If you'd like to find out more, you can head over to my website, rachelcarter.co.uk, or you can head to any of the socials, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube to find out more about the project. Thanks for listening.